Hello. The presentation you're currently watching is entitled Millennial Magic, Our Young Practitioners Avoiding Covens, Teachers, and Pagan Identity. My name is Dioan Cleveland. I am a CMC graduate from Cherry Hill Seminary and a deacon of Sacred Well Congregation. This was originally presented at the 2019 Conference on Current Pagan Studies and is currently being recorded live, so I hope you will forgive me any pauses or edits. This presentation started because I kept hearing the same conversations over and over again. I've been fortunate enough to be able to work with people of several different generations. Primarily, my work is with millennials, people between the ages of 20 and late 30s. But I've also had the incredible fortune to be able to work with people within Generation X and within the baby boomer generation, all of which practitioners of one form or the other. And among the older generations, Generation X, baby boomers, I kept hearing the same comments over and over again. I kept hearing variations on, young pagans these days, why aren't they coming to learn from us as elders? Why aren't they joining our covens? Why aren't they attending events? Where are they? I thought this deserved more look. This presentation is going to take a look at the millennial generation. First thing it's going to do is discuss pagans as a whole, so we can start looking at general trends. We'll then look at the trends of millennials as a whole, not necessarily within the pagan community. And then we'll look at the increasingly non-religious community of millennials who are still practicing spirituality. And we'll use these three factors to understand what is happening with the current spiritual generation of millennial practitioners. The primary sources of research we're going to use are going to be Holly Amor's survey and research done for her MDiv thesis at Cherry Hill Seminary. Since then, she now serves on the board of directors of Interfaith Partners of South Carolina and also works with the Red Cross. She did a survey of about 1,651 web-based interviews, and this was focusing on identity as pagan, on group membership, and on spiritual support. We're also going to look at Pew surveys done in 2014, 2017, and 2018. This is going to be the Religious Landscape Survey, the American Trends Panel, and the Religious Typology Survey. Pew Research is a independent study group, so these will not necessarily be pagan specific. These are going to be broader numbers. We're also going to look a little bit at the research of Barna done in 2016. It was about 1,200 web-based interviews of U.S. adults. This survey I'm not as sure on. Unfortunately, Barna has some ideological biases. However, they're currently used by Salvation Army, Habitat for Humanity, Sony, Humane Society, Gates Foundation, NBC Universal, so their research warrants looking at. Let's start looking at pagans as a whole. We're going to be looking at the trend of moving away from groups, covens, and teachers. We start by looking at the identified pagan and Wiccan populations within the United States, and that population is rising dramatically. We look at the 1990s, where about 13,000 people identified as pagan or Wiccan. Mind you, these are self-identified, not necessarily actual numbers. In 2000, that jumped sharply. 500,000 people were happy to identify as either pagan or Wiccan. In 2007, we look at 864,000, or about 0.3% of the population. And in 2014, the most recent survey for Religious Landscape, 1.09 million, or about 0.3.5% of the population of the United States identified as pagan or Wiccan of some sort or another. Compare that to Presbyterians, who make up about 4.5 million, and Unitarian Universalists, who make up just over 3 million. This number actually interests me because for a while there was a article going around saying that witches were outnumbering Presbyterians. This was being passed around and celebrated by Wiccans and pagans alike. Unfortunately, this article purported to cite Pew, and what they cited was incorrect. There was no links to the Pew survey whatsoever. And when you actually look at the Pew numbers, Presbyterians still far outnumber pagan and Wiccans. But 1.09 million is a lot of pagan and Wiccans. I will also note that that sharp jump from 1990 to 2000 is sometimes attributed to the teen witch boom, the Silver Raven Wolf books, and the like that gained popularity. However, in the 2012 issue of the Pomegranate, James R. Lewis talks about the studies of pagan identity and says that the actual boom that happened during that 90s was, quote, a noisy side act featuring an ephemeral fad that did little more than distract attention from the real story of contemporary paganism's emergence as a maturing religious tradition. Essentially, the numbers kept going up. So that was not due solely to that particular boom. Holly Emmer's survey, which focused specifically on identified pagans, started looking at some of their practice. Emmer found that 67.4% said they do not regularly meet in groups. Helen Berger had a very similar study in her 2010 Pagan Census Revisited, where she found that between 2001 and 2010, the number of solitaries went from 51% to 79%. 8 in 10 pagans say they primarily practice as solitary practitioners. 2/3 of them, however, still meet with other pagans at least once a year for spiritual activities, and 1/3 of them say that they do so on a monthly basis. Just over 75% of pagans, 3/4, meet with other pagans for social reasons as well, and approximately 1/4 of pagans say they do so every week. When we look at Helen Berger's census, we narrow those numbers down a little bit as well. We start talking about training and find that 36% of surveyed pagans say they were trained in a group. Only 1 in 3 pagans trained in an actual group. Berger says that this is likely the availability of training books and resources, the series of how-to books that are heavily geared towards the solitary practitioner in general, and made it possible for individuals to start learning the religion and practice alone. Books, however, do still remain more influential in pagans' memories than any other training system. 37% of pagans claim that they first learned about the religion from books, only 30% from a friend, and 17% from the internet. And this is across spectrum, so this includes the tech-savvy younger generation. Emmer's survey tried to narrow down why we had so many solitaries. And it did so by asking 2 separate questions. The first was, why are you solitary? Or, quote, when you prefer to practice your spirituality as a solitary, why? And she found that the primary reasons came down to anonymity, convenience, lack of a group that fits, an avoidance of dysfunction, and the preference to be alone. She also asked why survey respondents believed that other people choose to practice alone. And she found that the vast majority of people who were responding said they thought people just couldn't find a group, 64% of them, or would just rather be solitary, or even haven't found meaningful practice in a group. But without groups, she tried to narrow down where they were getting their spiritual support. 79% of pagans who do not practice in any kind of regular group primarily get their spiritual support from either friends and family, online, or they haven't got a clue where to find spiritual support. Which means we're looking at 8 in 10 pagans having no real trained spiritual support structure. So with those numbers in mind, let's go ahead and put them aside for a moment. We'll return to them and look at millennials as a whole. This is going to be millennials altogether, not just pagan, so that we can build a character of this generation. First, a short definition. Millennial is going to be anyone born between 1981 and 1996. This was Pew Research's definition thereof. Sometimes called Generation Y, also Echo Boomers, because there was a surge in birth rates between the 1980s and 1990s. These are usually going to be children of baby boomers, and they're generally going to be understood to be very familiar with communications, media, and digital technology. That's generally seen to be their primary character. We're going to use the word for ease. We're going to say millennial so that we don't have to continue to say adults within their 20s and 30s. But also remember that one of the biggest trends among millennials is that they dislike the identity of millennial. So I'm going to continue to use the word, but understand that many people within this age group might not consider themselves to be millennials. So let's get an idea for millennials as a whole. We're talking about 70 million people in the US as a whole. The defining factors of millennials are going to be that they are less white than previous generations, they are slightly more educated than previous generations, they are less married than previous generation, they actually use libraries more than previous generations, which I found to be an interesting statistic. They are more likely to live in poverty than previous generations. But more important to our presentation, let's actually look at the rate of millennials who are not identifying with religion. This is up from previous generations. 36% of younger millennials identify as not affiliated, 34% of older millennials, and this is compared to 23% of Generation X. We see that as the generations get younger, they're more likely to identify as nons or not affiliated. Among spiritual but not religious respondents to Barna's survey, 30% of those were SBNRs, though 33% were Gen X, so this actually isn't a positive change in that direction. And in general, this lack of identity seems to be specifically a lost confidence in larger organizations. Pew Research found that millennials' ratings of news media, religious organizations were both on rapid decline in comparison with any other generation whatsoever. And Michael Hout, professor of sociology at New York University, said, quote, "Since 2010, millennials' ratings of churches and other religious organizations has dipped 18 percentage points. 55% now say churches have a positive impact on the country, compared with 5 years ago, when nearly 3/4 said this. That's 73% to 55%, a sharp decline of millennials having any confidence in churches and religious organizations." Quote, "You see evidence of their lack of trust in the labor market, with government, in marriage, and in other aspects of life. General social survey data on confidence in the leadership of major institutions show that younger people, particularly, are not confident as other adults when it comes to institutions like the press, government, and churches." So we can see that millennials and their lack of trust in larger organizations are definitely straying away from religion as a whole. But is the rest of America? Are Americans as a whole not identifying with any religion? And are many of these non-affiliated people still very similar to pagans when we actually look at their practices? Pew Research actually found that a new rising identity called SBNR is taking hold of America. Pew actually had to coin the term. It means spiritual but not religious, because when they were doing surveys, people weren't choosing atheist or agnostic. They were identifying as non-affiliated, and yet still showing spiritual practice. So Pew asked, how much do you consider yourself religious? How much do you consider yourself spiritual? And match the numbers. Quote, "The SBNR phenomenon can be characterized as a mix of intellectual progressivism and a mystical hunger, impatient with the piety of established churches." We see 27% of America, up 8 percentage points in 5 years, identifying as being spiritual, yet not religious, with other markers such as religious and spiritual drastically down. How do we define these two terms, though? Well, Among spiritual but not religious people, they see spirituality as being indicative of personal, intuitive, inspirational, and loving. Whereas they see religion as institutional, dogmatic, controlling, manipulative, insincere, and abusive. Barna found that the rates of people who considered religion to be mostly harmful was rapidly going up, with millennials being close to, if not over, 50%. But should we as pagans pay attention to the SBNR movement? At first glance, SBNRs would seem to be more like Unitarian Universalists than pagan, with 65% to 73% saying that religious teachings are universal to all religion. But when we look at the numbers a little closer, we find, firstly, Emor's study showing that pagans, specifically identified pagans, also asked of their spirituality versus religiousness. 21% of them said they were, specifically, SBNRs, spiritual but not religious. What about those who don't identify as pagan? Are SBNRs as a whole practicing pagan or pagan-adjacent spiritualities without identifying? Pew asked about New Age beliefs, specifically psychics, reincarnation, astrology, and spiritual energy being located in physical things. And they found that nons rated higher than any other affiliation in these beliefs. 78% of them believe in at least one of those four markers, 62% of course being the US average, and over half of them believe in reincarnation or psychics. This is compared to 33% of Americans as a whole believing in reincarnation and 41% believing in psychics. And 61% of nons believe that spiritual energy can be located in physical things, compared to 42% of U.S. adults as a whole. The 2014 Pew survey also narrowed down that among SBNRs, among nons, they have a high rate of spiritual practice. 70% pray daily, 58% meditate, 68% feel daily wonder about the universe, and 73% feel spiritual peace or well-being at least once a week. In fact, Robert Fuller, author of Spiritual But Not Religious, Understanding Unchurched America, actually specifically tells us that SBNRs are indeed related to feminist spiritual and religious thought, that they're related to ecological spiritualities, to neo-paganism, Wicca, shamanic, druidic, Gaian, and ceremonial magic practices. He tells us that they follow New Age practices, such as astrology, Ouija boards, tarot cards, and the I Ching, and that a common practice of SBNRs is meditation, such as mindfulness and transcendental meditation. So we know that SBNRs are practicing pagan and pagan-like spiritual practices, but does that necessarily make them pagan? Well, are SBNRs polytheists? If we define pagan as believing in more than one god, according to Barna, 48% of SBNRs say they believe in only one god, and they interpret this as 51 to 52% being specifically polytheistic. Now, I reserve judgment because Barna's politics are specifically evangelical. I don't know that I agree that everyone who responded that no, they didn't believe in only one god necessarily believes and worships multiple gods. But it's the number we have for this rating, so we're going to look at it. And pagan organizations are starting to notice. They're starting to include SBNRs in their pagan ministry. Cherry Hill's community ministry training actually includes, in one lecture, some of the same statistics that we've just gone over on SBNRs, and advises ministry students, quote, "Some will seek out a pagan minister, even if they do not identify as pagan." So, let's bring it all together. What does all of this mean for our understanding of younger pagans? Well, firstly, we've seen that pagans as a whole are becoming more solitary. Secondly, we've seen that millennials as a whole are identifying more as SBNRs and avoiding religious identification at all. And thirdly, we've seen that SBNRs are heavily influenced by pagan and pagan-adjacent spiritualities. Any discussion of younger pagans needs to recognize that they tend to be solitary about their spirituality, and just as the millennial generation as a whole, they tend to avoid religious affiliation. Why this shift, though? Why are younger pagans going away from the coven system and, in fact, no longer identifying it as anything other than spiritual? Well, Julian Vane, writing for a new generation of witches, defines the biggest difference between the training and socialization of younger pagans to be the media they were introduced to and the availability of information via the internet, which echoes Helen Berger's findings of the community as a whole. Vane looked at the difference between his craft introduction and the introduction that many millennials have of the craft. Vane says that when he was introduced to the craft, the coven was the main unit where witchcraft was worked and learned. There was a heavy emphasis on initiation, and Wicca was seen as a mystery religion. He also notes that information was much rarer, with books having to be special ordered and teachers being only occasionally available. By contrast, most millennials came to the craft when the model of the solitary witch was firmly established, and where the popular images from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and other media showed witches as solo practitioners. He also mentions that the rise in interest of the cunning man or cunning woman is also seen as an incredibly solo practice. And he notes the abundance of user-friendly, accessible information where modern millennials can be introduced to the craft through any number of 101 guides, podcasts, blogs, etc. But even with these trends towards solitary practice and ungrouped practitioners, most still want groups. In fact, 72% of pagans as a whole, not just in the millennial generation, say they would attend a group if they found a good fit. In specific, practitioners say that they still want a group for learning, discussion, for the community, for the support, and for initiations and group rituals. Well, what does good fit mean? What would draw these people to a coven or group? Let's start by looking at what hasn't worked in the past. When they reach out for spiritual support and have not found it helpful, primarily this was because of poor or ineffective support, dogmatic or rigid providers, and judgmental or blaming support. What has worked has been support that was listening, that had wisdom, experience, empathy, affirmation, emotional support, discussion, and an open and non-judgmental style of support. In general, what we seem to find is that the covens they've run into and the spiritual mentors they've run into have made them wary that they're going to continue to receive dogmatic or inexperienced support. So let's bring this all together. What are our conclusions here? Well, despite rising numbers of identified pagans, millennial age practitioners are increasingly solitary. Might not even call themselves pagans. They might be, in fact, missing from our pagan numbers as a whole because they don't identify. And they're avoiding membership or affiliation as a whole, and therefore are lacking in a desired opportunity for learning, community, and support. What do we do about this? Let's look at some resources for leadership. In Holly Ammer's survey, she suggests that in order to adapt to the change from group to solitary, which has been noted by her, Reese, Berger, and many others, what we'll need to do is rethink the rigidity of some of our training and structure. Quote, leaders must balance their ideals of how group participation should look with the reality of the actual needs and desires of potential group members. Building flexibility into ministry methods will be a necessary change in order for pagan groups to remain relevant and resilient. This is from Holly Amor's MDiv study, Group or Solitary, Choices in Spiritual Care and Needs in Contemporary Pagan Practice. Julian Vane, in The Discovery of Witchcraft, notes that newer generations' views on magic have become less psychological in nature and more utilitarian. Quote, contemporary witchcraft has come to occupy a position closer to the practices associated with occult traditions such as Macumba, Santeria, or Voodoo. He says, the magic is low-tech in a ritual sense, usually consisting of short chants or poems in comparison to the Hermetic-style soliloquies of ritual magic or Alexandrian Gardnerian Wicca, grounded in the use of actual power objects rather than more psychological approach, and able to be carried out effectively, whatever the religious beliefs of the practitioner. And in order to understand how to reach out to these espionars who are very close to pagans, we look to the advice of Christian author Philip Culbertson. In his book Caring for God's People, he discusses similar trends in the Episcopal Church and reminds us that we need to include seekers who don't necessarily identify strictly in our own religious camp. Quote, ministry in the new millennium will mean working among many types of people to whom we have not traditionally offered one-on-one care, and yet who need the sort of healing that God calls us to offer. I argue that among pagans, that could be rewritten the sort of healing that the gods call us to offer. This has been my presentation attempting to understand millennials in the pagan culture. If you take nothing more away from this, I hope what you will understand is that a large number of people who are practicing pagan practices, who desire holidays and magical training and spiritual support, don't call themselves pagan. Either because they avoid religious terminology as a whole, or because we as pagans tend to offer our support to fellow pagans, and have not yet reached towards the spiritual and unaffiliated among us. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you have found something that you can use going forward in your spiritual work. I have been Dio in Cleveland, and if you would like to contact me, you may find me at paganminister.com, or just send me an email, contact@paganminister.com. Have a fantastic day.